I'm here with T.J Lovat, the author of the sequel to Son of a Jacobite, and the new book is called The Jacobite Grandson. Congratulations on this book.
Thank you very much.
So what does it feel like to write a sequel? What's different about writing a sequel to writing the original book?
I think one of the differences is that you know the characters, at least some of the characters. You've been with them through their experiences, you know how they're going to react or how you think they're going to react. You also, I think, have a better idea, obviously, of where the whole story's going. This is the second of a trilogy, so there's something in the distance, something to come, and you have a better idea of what that is.
So we'll come back to those characters because I want to ask you a little bit more about some of them in particular, but what did you actually set out to do in this story that was different to the first book?
By the time I wrote this, I knew I was writing a trilogy.
Right.
So the first book is clearly where it all starts. The last book will be where you want to bring it to. So this is the transition. You've got to somehow keep the pace going to get to the crescendo, if you like, that you're wanting to build to. Often I know the middle book of a trilogy can be the least exciting. I wanted to make sure that didn't happen.
Well, you certainly achieved that because this really is a romp, isn't it? It's such a fast-paced book. There's so much action. It crosses continents. It crosses ages and stages. We see the growing up of the protagonist in this story. But there's also so much tragedy and grief and life events going on. So there's births, deaths and marriages throughout. So when you say you tried to keep the pace, absolutely you did that. But how did you negotiate these significant life events and yet give us time with each of the characters and slow us down to get inside the heads and hearts of the characters?
I think part of that's the way I try and write. I'm part of a group now of historical novelists. So I've learned a lot more than I knew when I started about how historical novels sort of build. And there's no one way, just as there's no one way of writing anything. There's no one way of putting an historical novel together. What I've tried to do in this, as I've tried to do in all the writing, is to enter into the lives of the characters. I don't have a huge plan. Some authors do. They know exactly where the whole thing's going. I don't. And I think that keeps a certain freshness to it. I mean, life is full of surprises. We don't know what's going to happen in 30 seconds or next week, or certainly in 10 years' time. So I've tried to keep the book like that. Things happen, unexpected. They're a surprise. They're a surprise to me, even as the author. Mm-hmm. I think that sort of keeps some of the reality alive.
So about these characters, you've spent a lot more time with them now. We met a lot of them in the first book and they've aged and developed. Spending this time with your characters, were there things that surprised you about them? Not about what they did or where they went, but aspects of their character that revealed themselves to you while you were writing?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's life. Life's full of surprises, as I say. So somehow or other you've got to keep the surprise element of life going. Otherwise the whole thing becomes a bit too plastic. Your characters are too predictable. I didn't want that. I wanted the light and the shade to be there with all of the characters. Someone said about some of the characters in the first novel that, some of them were just a little bit too good to be true. Mm-hmm. I didn't want that. That's not reality. So I think all of the characters, there's admirable qualities, but they're all clay-footed as well. Mm-hmm. Some of them very clay-footed. There's some quite nasty characters.
Yes, indeed. So in the first book, one of the most compelling characters, I think, was Mardia, the woman from Persia that the protagonist in the first book, the son of the Jacobite, falls in love with. And she really casts a shadow in some ways over the sequel, doesn't she? There's a retelling in some ways of that story as the father's telling the story to the son, but in more ways than that she seems to sort of infiltrate the story and the hearts of the characters. Would you like to just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, you asked me who I thought the hero was at the last launch, and I didn't give it away because most of the people hadn't read the book. Maybe they still haven't.
Spoiler.
But that's too bad. But I think I said at the time something like, to me, the hero is a heroine, and that was Mardia. I think she remains in many ways the most significant character, perhaps all the way through. She sort of becomes this ghostly sort of presence that somehow captures the beliefs and the values, the really important world views that Thomas and Edward in fact carry with them through life.
And so we see this also in some of the education and theological discussions that are going on in the story as well. And some of that's encapsulated in the character of Father Pritchard, the Jesuit priest and teacher. I'm just interested in the very enlightened ideas that he brings to his practice of theology and education. And I know that some of those views are very much your own views. So I quite like Father Pritchard.
Good. I'd be worried if you didn't. Yeah, well, I mean, there's two sides to that. There's the teacher in me, I guess. Good teaching, somebody who can bring science to life, something that so many people find boring and it shouldn't. So he encapsulates that. But he's also theologically well informed, surrounded by, what you'd have to call theological illiteracy, a Jesuit boss who has no theology, and somehow he's got to cope with that. There's a change in the papacy from a fairly liberal informed pope to a very, very conservative reactionary pope. Pritchard somehow or other holds it together. His theological education and indeed his scientific literacy sort of carries him through those sorts of challenges.
Now, this is ostensibly a novel, but clearly there's parts of this which emerge from your own family history and your own attachment to Scotland because of that. So I'm just wondering, when you set out to write, is it a novel? Is it a family history? Is it creative fiction? What's going on there? How much of it's true?
How much of it's true? I did quite a bit of history on my family, back as far as I could get. I got back to within a generation of the Jacobite rebellion, the devastation of Culloden, but couldn't get back any further. All sorts of hints that the family was involved in that. They were Jacobites. They were referred to with Jacobite slurring kinds of words.
And that's of course how the first book opens.
That's how the first book opens, and so the first book's very much about filling that gap. But in a sense then, turning to novel, turning to fiction was a bit of a problem solver because the records weren't there. But I guess what I've discovered through engaging in this sort of writing is the power of the novel, the power of creative writing. For instance, the Father Pritchards of this world and a whole lot of others where you can put words in their mouths that actually convey a whole lot of the beliefs that you think your family probably held because they were slurred as Jacobites. They had some rebellious thing in them. there was a resistance to establishment, and that's a consistent theme, I think, with all of the central characters. They're caught between being somehow or other part of a sort of nobility, a Scottish nobility. They're not impoverished, they're part of a sort of an elite, and yet they rebel against establishment, particularly the injustices of establishment.
Sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it, really? Okay, so last question. This book to me is different to the first because there's much more attention to place and to the natural features in the landscapes, and particularly in the flora of several different countries, without giving the plot away. And of course, Father Pritchard refers to this in his sermons and in his teaching. So I'm just interested in this diversion into the natural world.
Yeah, in many ways it's not a diversion, because the whole Jacobite thing is rooted in Highland Indigenous culture. Mm-hmm. They were more the Lord Lovat, who lost his head after Culloden. He's more Indigenous than any kind of British noble. And so, as the story develops, yes, with one of the key characters in this new book, the whole thing of place, and particularly the flora of place, becomes hugely important. But I suppose the way I see it, that was always in his blood, the sense of place, the way Indigenous culture understands the importance of place, the environment, creation around us, where we belong to it. It doesn't belong to us. That comes through very strongly, I think, in the way that the central character in this book develops.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got some great questions coming in. First one is, who is your favourite character in the second book?
It's a woman. But I won't say any more than that.
All right, so there's a bit of a tradition there, isn't there? Because
there is a bit of a tradition.
Mardia in the first book.
You've got to read the book, then I'll tell you.
All right. Okay, we've got a second question here. Who's your favourite interviewer? Just kidding. Here's another question.
I'm thinking about that.
So why did you choose to write a trilogy rather than a series?
It wasn't part of the original idea. I really just wanted to, in the end, fictionalise of necessity what I didn't have the records about. It turned out to be a bigger story than I was anticipating. And so then I realised that the trilogy was probably the better way to sort of capture the genre. I read about trilogies, the beginning, the end, and the middle, and the transition, and particularly in historical novels, because the middle one is important. It actually transitions more from, if you like, the pure fiction through to the history that you're trying to cover. So it actually is an important book, and I think that becomes obvious when you read this one. There's more and more of real history in this one.
Mm-hmm. So there's some really interesting historical characters in this second book. People have asked, how do you choose which significant historical characters actually cross paths with your characters? How do you choose the famous people that make it into the book and those that don't?
I guess that's my choice. So in the first book, to give an example, Thomas Jefferson, I know a lot about that period of history. He fascinates me that somebody could, for all his faults and for all his lack of sense of justice about certain matters, he had an amazing mind. He had a sense of justice, human rights and those sorts of things that eventually finds its way into the US Constitution. More important now than ever to remember some of that history. And then in the second book, I have a very, very strong sense of justice. And I think that becomes obvious when you read this one. There's more and more of real history in this one.
Mm-hmm. So there's some really interesting historical characters in this second book. People have asked, how do you choose which significant historical characters actually cross paths with your characters? How do you choose the famous people that make it into the book and those that don't?
I guess that's my choice. so I wanted to give him life, and I wanted Thomas to have some sort of social engagement with him. Would be part of his formative experience. I've been keen with all of the characters to give them a taste, if you like, of the different social classes, different castes. So they mix with the Jeffersons of this world, equivalent characters in the second book, but they also talk with and get to know the down and outers. In this book, convicts, as well as the indigenous people, which takes the key character here from his indigenous Highland culture through to a sense of understanding Australian indigenous culture and its beliefs and values and its connection with land, etc.
I just love this book. I love the first one, I love the second one. It's such a good read, and we're absolutely looking forward to the third one as well, and you give a little bit of a hint at the end there what's going on with the third. So thanks so much.
Thank you.